You know that feeling when something breaks and before anyone else even reacts, you're already halfway to fixing it? Not because you're trying to impress anyone, not because you need credit. It just feels automatic. Handle it, contain it, move on. There's a certain kind of person who learned early that waiting around wasn't a strategy. If something needed doing, you did it. If something hurt, you dealt with it quietly. If something felt uncertain, you prepared for the worst and hoped you wouldn't need to use the backup plan. Most people don't notice this pattern. They just see someone calm, self-sufficient, maybe a little hard to read. And sometimes that calm gets misinterpreted. Detached, cynical, emotionally unavailable, too independent. But there's a difference between not feeling and learning to feel without spectacle. There's a difference between cynicism and pattern recognition. And when we talk about the psychology of Generation X, this difference matters. Because Generation X, those born roughly between the mid-1960s and around 1980, developed in a cultural pocket that rarely gets examined with nuance. Boomers are analyzed. Millennials are debated. Gen Z is dissected in real time. But Gen X often sits in the middle, assumed to be fine. If you found this relatable, drop a like and subscribe to join the Elite Echoes community. There's more going on there than people realize. Developmental psychology tells us something simple but powerful. The nervous system calibrates itself based on early environment. Not based on what's ideal, but on what's consistent. Gen X came of age during a period marked by rising divorce rates, dual-income households, economic restructuring, Cold War anxiety, and a growing cultural skepticism toward institutions. By the mid-1980s, millions of children were regularly unsupervised after school. The latchkey kid wasn't an exception. It was a norm. When you repeatedly come home to an empty house, your brain learns something quietly. You are the first line of response. Neuroscience calls this adaptation. The stress response system becomes efficient. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and anticipating consequences, gets heavily recruited. You start thinking 3 steps ahead because that's what kept things stable. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels practical. At the same time, Gen X grew up watching promises unravel. Companies that guaranteed security downsized without warning. Political scandals eroded trust. Cultural narratives about stability shifted quickly. Psychologists sometimes use the term defensive pessimism to describe a strategy where people lower expectations to manage uncertainty. But for many in Gen X, it wasn't pessimism, it was calibration. If the rules can change, stay flexible. If security isn't guaranteed, build skills. If systems fail, don't rely on them completely. From the outside, this can look like skepticism, but underneath, it's nervous system memory. There's also the matter of privacy. Gen X experienced adolescence before social media, before digital permanence. Mistakes faded, embarrassment stayed local. Developmental research shows that when identity forms without constant surveillance, it tends to solidify internally rather than performatively. Your sense of self doesn't depend as heavily on external validation. So when public oversharing became normalized, it didn't feel liberating. It felt exposed. That doesn't mean one way is better. It means different generations encoded visibility differently. For Gen X, visibility often equaled vulnerability. And then there's work. Many Gen Xers started working young. Paper routes, retail, service jobs where responsibility was immediate and tangible. You showed up. You delivered. You calculated change in your head when the register failed. Effort translated directly into outcome. Behavioral science calls this a high contingency environment. Actions and consequences closely linked. In those environments, people develop strong internal locus of control. You focus on what you can manage. Skill becomes currency. At the same time, Gen X watched corporate loyalty dissolve. They saw restructuring, layoffs, market crashes, the dot-com bubble burst. The 2008 financial crisis hit many right in mid-career. Economically, it was a generation repeatedly reminded that nothing is permanent. So the psychological response wasn't grand ambition. It was competence. Stay employable, stay adaptable. Don't expect guarantees. There's a paradox here. Gen X is often described as fiercely independent. And that's true. But independence wasn't necessarily a preference, it was rehearsal. When children adapt to environments where emotional support isn't always available, they don't stop needing connection. They simply learn not to rely on it predictably. Studies in adult attachment patterns show that high self-reliance can coexist with deep loyalty. It just expresses differently. Gen X may not ask for help easily, but they show up quietly without broadcasting it. And that quietness can be misread. They respect competence more than titles. They question authority not out of rebellion, but because they watched authority fail in visible ways. Watergate, institutional mismanagement, economic volatility. When early authority figures appear inconsistent, children often grow into adults who verify rather than blindly trust. It's not defiance, it's pattern memory. There's another layer that rarely gets discussed. When you learn early to handle things alone, you become extremely capable in crisis. Your nervous system doesn't spike as quickly. You've rehearsed problem solving. But that same wiring can make rest feel unnatural. If you're always scanning for the next issue, calm can feel suspicious. That's the trade-off. High competence, low drama. But sometimes difficulty receiving support. And again, this isn't better or worse than any other generational adaptation. Millennials developed hyper-collaboration and digital fluency. Gen Z navigates emotional vocabulary with sophistication. Boomers carried post-war optimism and institutional building. Each generation is a product of its environmental pressures. Gen X simply developed in the gap between analog and digital, institutional promise and institutional doubt, supervision and autonomy. They are, in many ways, the bridge generation, and bridges rarely get celebrated. They just hold weight. If you're part of Gen X, you might recognize this subtle internal narrative. Don't make it a big deal. Handle it. Stay steady. Keep moving. But steadiness doesn't mean you weren't shaped. It doesn't mean there wasn't loneliness in that independence. It doesn't mean there wasn't uncertainty behind the irony and dry humor that became a cultural signature. Irony, after all, is often emotional distance with a smile. What's interesting is that many Gen X parents swung the pendulum the other way. They offered their children more supervision, more emotional presence, more visible support. Not because they were critical of their own upbringing, but because the nervous system tends to correct what it lacked. And sometimes that creates quiet tension. Watching your children grow up in constant visibility can feel both comforting and unnerving. The world seems louder now, faster, more exposed. But here's the truth beneath all of it. The Gen X psyche makes sense. The independence makes sense. The skepticism makes sense. The loyalty to competence makes sense. The privacy makes sense. It was an intelligent adaptation to a particular moment in history. You are not emotionally cold. You are calibrated. You are not cynical. You are experienced. You are not detached. You are measured. And measured people often carry more than they reveal. If this reflection feels familiar, there's more to explore. Not just about generations, but about how environments quietly sculpt identity in ways we rarely name. And please don't forget to subscribe.